May tred niletante junto treteseten, just outside Temple, Texas. The sky was the color of bleached denim, stretched thin above the scrub plains of Bell County. A dry wind danced through the fields, carrying the faint scent of rust, cotton, and manure. In the distance, a battered Ford pickup ticked and cooled beneath a live oak, its hood still warm from the morning's drive into town. Harold Whitlock stood alone in his field, a burlap sack slung over his shoulder, boots sunk in the soft dirt. He was 51, sun-seared and lean, with a slow drawl and calloused hands that had turned the same soil his father and grandfather had worked before him. But today, he wasn't planting corn or turning compost. Today, he was trying something new. From the torn sack, Harold scooped out a pale, chalky blend, a crude mix of ammonium nitrate scraped from old cattle feed supplements, sulfur scraped from a nearby oil site, and pulverized limestone from a dry creek bed. He'd spent weeks tweaking the proportions in a rusted drum behind his barn. The neighbors said it was nonsense. His cousin called it half fertilizer, half funeral pyre. One rancher muttered it looked like something you'd spread on a crime scene, not a cornfield. But Harold believed in what he'd made. He wasn't a scientist, didn't finish school past the 8th grade. But he watched the land like a hawk. He knew what made the soil breathe. The rains had been scarce, and the cotton wasn't coming up like it used to. Something had to change. So he tinkered, mixed, burned a few patches of grass by accident, laughed, cursed, tried again. The first batch went into a test plot near the windmill. By mid-April, that patch was thriving richer greens, faster growth, deeper roots. He kept it quiet, but it didn't stay quiet long. One morning, a passing county agent on his way to a poultry inspection caught sight of the odd-colored rows. He stopped, walked out, took a sample. 2 weeks later, a government vehicle rolled up his drive, quiet as a prayer. 3 men in suits, one with a clipboard, asked polite but pointed questions. "Where'd you learn to mix like that, Mr. Whitlock?" "I didn't learn it nowhere," Harold replied. "Just figured I'd see what the dirt liked." They took notes, took photos, didn't smile much. Harold didn't know it yet, but the world was about to change, not just for him, but for every soldier, sailor, and bomber crewman that would soon go to war. What he'd stumbled upon in his dusty field wasn't just a better way to grow cotton. It was a stable, cheap, high-yield base compound, one that could be refined into an explosive more reliable than TNT, easier to ship and ready to scale. He had no factory, no patent, no army contract, just a tin bucket, a bad back, and a fertilizer mix that didn't make sense to anyone else. But in time, it would speak for itself in the rumble of artillery, the crack of demolition charges, and the fiery breath of progress across a world set ablaze. October 14th, 1940, College Station, Texas. In a quiet lab, tucked behind the chemistry hall at Texas A&M, a stack of manila folders sat unopened on a metal desk. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled faintly of formaldehyde and burnt magnesium. Dr. Alan Keene adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and peered at the sample in front of him, a pale, flaky powder sent from Bell County under a generic label. Soil additive, type B. He didn't know the farmer, didn't know the origin. All he had was a memo from someone at the Department of Agriculture that said, "Unusual composition, potential stability under heat. Investigate." He poured the powder into a crucible, lit the flame, and waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then a subtle but unmistakable flash. Not violent, not dangerous, but steady, predictable. Keene sat back. "That's not just fertilizer," he muttered. Within weeks, the test results were on the desk of Colonel Dwight Ramsey at Fort Sam Houston. The war in Europe was escalating fast, and Washington was already stockpiling materials. Traditional explosives were expensive to produce. TNT, RDX, all volatile, all resource-heavy. But here was a compound with promise. It could be transported without risk. It didn't sweat or weep like nitroglycerin. And most importantly, it could be made in bulk, from dirt and cow feed. Colonel Ramsey circled one line in the report: thermal stability under stress, low detonation threshold when primed. It was just a farmer's blend, not designed for weapons, not crafted for destruction. But with the right refinement, this strange concoction could become a booster agent for military demolitions, or even an element in artillery shell fillings. Ramsey made a phone call. 2 weeks later, Harold Whitlock's front porch groaned under the boots of 4 men in government-issued trench coats. They didn't introduce themselves by rank. One simply handed Harold a letter stamped with the seal of the War Department. Another asked if Harold had ever thought about licensing his soil mix. Harold scratched his neck. "It ain't for sale," he said. "It's not a sale," the man replied. "It's a service. To your country." They offered him something else. Silence and a monthly check. The contract was strange. No public recognition, no name attached. Harold would continue making small test batches on his land, which would be quietly collected by trucks that came at night. The government would take it from there. He signed. He didn't know that his blend would be shipped to Oak Ridge, to Los Alamos, to Eglin Field, that it would be studied, altered, and ultimately folded into hundreds of explosive formulations from anti-tank mines to demolition satchels used by rangers in Italy. All he knew was that something he'd made out of desperation was now part of something much larger. And that silence, heavy, official silence, had settled over his land like morning fog. March 7th, 1942. The war was no longer overseas. It had a heartbeat in every American town: ration books, scrap drives, blackout curtains. But on the back roads of Bell County, something stranger was happening. Something no one was supposed to see. Just after midnight, an unmarked truck rolled up Harold Whitlock's driveway, its headlights off, its tires crunching soft dirt. 2 men stepped out, neither in uniform, but both moving with the efficiency of soldiers. They didn't knock. They just walked straight to the barn. Inside, lined up neatly beside feed sacks and old tractor parts, were 6 barrels filled with Harold's blend, dried, measured, and sealed by hand. He stood nearby in his long johns and boots, arms folded, watching them work. "Y'all ever think about telling me where it's going?" he asked. One of the men paused, looked up. "No, sir." That was the extent of it. Each week the pattern repeated. The trucks came in the dark, always different drivers, always silent. The barrels vanished. New ones were dropped off. Occasionally, a small crate arrived: rubber gloves, new scales, protective eyewear, and once, a manual marked "Combustion Dynamics Restricted." Harold never opened it. He just kept mixing. His wife, Lorna, said little. She'd grown used to the government's silence. The cash envelopes slipped into the storm cellar, and the fact that Harold now spent more time with barrels than with crops. But in town, people began to whisper. They noticed fuel drums delivered to a man who didn't drive more than 20 miles a week. They noticed strangers parked by his fields during church hours. And they noticed the Whitlock's bills always got paid on time in a town where that was starting to mean something. "Old Harry's selling moonshine," one man guessed. "Nah," said another. "Government types don't buy whiskey in bulk." The truth was far stranger. Back in Fort Worth, engineers at a classified facility known only as Station 9 were breaking down Harold's blend into its chemical components. They had cracked the code. His mix, when combined with a nitro compound, created a secondary explosive with enough stability to ship and store safely, but enough punch to crater a tank track or bring down a reinforced bunker wall. What he had created by accident was the key to a new family of field charges, ones that could be packed in satchels, planted under bridges, or dropped behind enemy lines with resistance fighters in Burma, Yugoslavia, and the Philippines. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the stuff of newspapers or victory parades. But it worked. And the army needed a lot of it. Soon, Harold's barrels weren't the only ones rolling across Texas. 2 counties over, a new facility was quietly built inside a converted grain mill. Then another in Abilene. Then one in New Mexico. All of them fed by the same formula, his formula adjusted, weaponized, scaled. But only Harold's had the original signature, the dirt under his boots, the smell of sweat and sulfur. He never asked what it was doing overseas. But deep down, he knew it was no longer fertilizer. September 18th, 1943. Cape Gloucester, New Britain. The jungle breathed steam. Heavy rain pounded down in sheets, soaking ammunition crates, rations, and skin alike. U.S. Marines crouched behind a muddy berm, just beyond the edge of an airstrip under Japanese control. They were pinned machine gun fire stitched the treetops, and snipers watched the clearings like ghosts. Second Lieutenant James Mallory, 1st Marine Division, wiped sweat from his eyes and looked at the bundle in his hands. It was compact, square, wrapped in oilcloth and twine. Inside, 6 pounds of composition charge packed in a canvas satchel, fused and rigged to demolish a bunker wall. Stamped on the tag, Lot 12, B, Temple, TX. Never been to Texas, Mallory muttered to his corporal. But I owe someone there a drink. The charge went off 10 minutes later, a thunderclap that cracked through the jungle canopy and collapsed a concrete pillbox along with the morale of the men inside. Marines stormed through. The battle for the airstrip turned. No one in that unit knew who Harold Whitlock was, but the compound he birthed in a dusty field was now clearing paths for flamethrower teams and combat engineers from Bougainville to Saipan. By late 1943, the formula had a name: AMX-4, Agricultural Mixture, Experimental, Type 4. Officially, it was a modified fertilizer compound, stabilized with binding agents and nitrates. Unofficially, it was the demolition man's best friend, cheaper than TNT, easier to mold than C2, and capable of burning hot even in wet, tropical conditions. At a munitions plant outside Waco, lines of women in coveralls packed the compound into cylindrical casings. Most had no idea what it really was. They just knew it didn't reek like cordite and didn't make your fingers numb after 12 hours of packing. They said it used to be for crops, one worker joked, rolling a charge into a crate. Now it grows craters. Government officials never acknowledged AMX-4 publicly. It wasn't in the headlines. There were no newsreels of ribbon-cutting ceremonies. It was considered auxiliary, a field utility blend for engineers and forward units. But the requests kept piling up. Field commanders wanted more. In the Philippines, resistance fighters dropped behind enemy lines requested AMX-4 over conventional explosives because it was easier to disguise in sacks of flour or sugar. In Burma, Merrill's marauders used it to blow trestle bridges. In Italy, combat engineers used it to cut gaps in mountain roads where German panzers were expected to retreat. And back in Texas, Harold kept working. His barrels now came with typed inventory forms, requisition numbers, and a small note at the bottom that read, Priority Code, Packfult. He didn't know what that meant, but it sounded important. He kept mixing. Sometimes, when he stood out by the windmill and looked west into the fading sun, he'd wonder if it all really started with one bad cotton season, if maybe God had a funny way of using broken things. Even Fertilizer, June 9th, 1944. Saipan. The beachhead was chaos. Navy destroyers thundered from offshore, their shells tearing into the tree line while smoke curled over the black sand. The 2nd Marine Division scrambled forward under mortar fire, boots slipping on coral and blood-soaked shale. Corporal Danny Ruiz hit the deck near a collapsed tank trap, breath ragged, ears ringing. In his backpack, bouncing with every crawl, were 2 canvas satchels. Inside, 8 pounds of AMX-4, packed tight around a 2-second fuse. The objective was a cave fortified, hidden, and machine gun ready. Danny had used regular satchel charges before. They were heavier, fickle, sometimes sweating chemicals in the heat. But these were light, dry, and when they blew, they stayed blown. He shoved one into the crevice, counted under his breath, and sprinted. The explosion sent a shockwave through the ridge. The hillside coughed smoke and flame. Japanese troops poured out in panic, and the Marines surged forward. Later that night, huddled behind a truck tire and a can of cold beans, Danny pulled the torn satchel label from his pocket. No brand, no origin. Just a black-stamped code and one faded line, mixed under License Agricultural Division. He laughed. Who the hell makes explosives on a farm? That question, by mid-1944, had reached the offices of the Army Corps of Engineers, the Office of Strategic Services, and even select officials inside the War Production Board. Harold Whitlock's name wasn't on any headlines, but his formula was now standard issue. And it wasn't just America using it. In Europe, the British began receiving modified AMX-4 blends under the Lend-Lease program. Commandos in Norway used it to sabotage rail lines. The French resistance used it in improvised car bombs that halted German convoys in Lyon. But even with battlefield success, AMX-4 remained in the shadows. The compound's origins were classified under a wartime designation, Rural Chemical Source Alpha. The government avoided calling attention to it. A wartime PR campaign couldn't exactly celebrate a farmer with no formal education outsmarting a half-dozen chemistry PhDs. It didn't fit the narrative of polished engineers and sleek labs. Still, results mattered. By mid-June, a new plant broke ground in Amarillo under the guise of agricultural processing. But the signs were lies. Inside, they packed hundreds of tons of Harold's mix per month, shipping them out in unmarked crates with forged dairy co-op stamps. The entire operation sat under the radar, even as it fueled the most violent theaters of war. Back in Bell County, Harold's hands never stopped moving. He didn't ask why they wanted more. He didn't need to. Every time the truck came, he watched it disappear down the dirt road with a quiet nod, not of pride, but of duty. He was just a farmer, but the earth he worked was now part of the fight. February 4th, 1945. The frost clung to the windows of the Whitlock farmhouse. Harold sat at the kitchen table, cradling a chipped coffee mug, the silence broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional groan of the floorboards settling under the cold. Lorna read the newspaper in the next room, more headlines from the Ardennes, more lists of boys who wouldn't be coming home. At 7:12 a.m., the knock came. Not the usual driver. Not the quiet men with clipboards. This one wore a suit gray, pressed, with a flag pin and polished shoes that had never seen Texas mud. He introduced himself as Special Agent Nathan Caldwell, Office of Strategic Resources. He spoke softly, but with weight. And he didn't waste time. "You know what you're mixing," Caldwell said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "We're asking for more, a lot more." Harold opened the folder. Inside was a blueprint, not for a farm, but for a facility. A real one. Concrete floors, ventilation, electrical diagrams. At the bottom, stamped in red, "Confidential. Facility Hassan 2B. Wichita Falls. TX. "They want me to run it?" Harold asked. "No. They want you to teach the men who will." He read the next page. It was a contract government issue, 10 pages thick. His name typed neatly at the top. But something else caught his eye. Near the bottom, in fine print, "All intellectual material associated with product AMX-4 remains property of the United States War Department. No individual recognition or financial compensation shall be made public until cessation of hostilities." Harold stared at that line. "So, I built the thing, but I don't own the thing." Caldwell didn't flinch. "No one owns anything in wartime, Mr. Whitlock." "Not really." Harold folded the papers slowly and slid them back across the table. "I'll keep mixing here," he said, standing. "But I don't need to see it turned into something I can't recognize." Caldwell said nothing for a while. Then, before he left, he reached into his coat and placed something on the table. It was a photograph, black and white, creased at the corners. A Marine squad standing in front of a smoldering cave in the Pacific, boots in the ash, grins full of exhaustion. One man held a cloth satchel in his left hand. On the satchel, Temple, TX, Lot 22. "See, they walked out of that hole because of you," Caldwell said, "whether they know it or not." Then he tipped his hat, turned, and walked out into the Texas cold. Harold didn't say much the rest of that day. But before sundown, he was back in the barn, adjusting ratios, checking barrels, and prepping another load. He never built the factory, never visited Wichita Falls, never stepped inside a government lab. But the mixing never stopped. And neither did the war. April 13th, 1945. The northern reaches of Luzon were burning. The 25th Infantry Division had been clawing its way through ravines and rice paddies for weeks, chasing the last remnants of Japanese forces into the mountains. Resistance was fierce, not just gunfire, but traps, rock slides, and entire passes rigged to collapse under advancing armor. Captain Ellis Morgan, a combat engineer from Iowa, had one job that morning: clear the narrow pass above Belite Ridge so the Sherman tanks could roll through by sundown. He crouched beside a granite outcropping, examining the charges his team had placed beneath a rusted culvert. The entire hillside needed to come down, but cleanly, with minimal collateral damage. Local villagers lived just below the ridgeline. Ellis held up a cloth-wrapped bundle, AMX-4, packed and pre-measured in tubes. "This stuff still amazes me," he muttered to his sergeant. "Came from a farm, they say." They wired the charges, set the fuse, and took cover. The earth cracked like thunder. The hillside buckled, then fell in clean layers, just as designed, sealing off the route and cutting off the retreating Japanese convoy that had been spotted hours before. Clean, controlled, devastating. The tanks rolled through by 3 p.m. A week later, in a classified field report filed under Special Materials Testing, Luzon Operations, AMX-4 received its highest battlefield rating yet. The note at the bottom read, "Ideal for precision demolitions in terrain, sensitive environments. Continue full deployment." Back in Bell County, Harold didn't know about Luzon. He didn't hear about Captain Morgan or the ridge collapse. But he did notice that the trucks came more frequently now, sometimes twice a week. One driver even brought coffee and stayed long enough to ask about the mixing ratios. Harold was cautious. "It's not exact," he said, measuring out the pale granules with his palm. "Depends on the humidity. Dirt talks to you if you let it." The driver blinked. "Dirt talks?" Harold nodded. Louder than most men. That spring, a new type of envelope arrived with his name heavier, stamped from a different office. Inside, 5 war bonds, unsigned, and a note with no return address. Just one line: "Your contribution remains classified, but not unappreciated." Lorna framed it in the hallway. Neighbors still didn't know what he was doing. Some thought he'd been hired by a chemical company. Others believed he was running some secret soil experiment for Washington. But the truth remained, between Harold, his barrels, and the long line of trucks that kept arriving in the dark. He didn't ask questions. Not when young men were dying overseas. Not when his own nephew, Curtis, sent back a photo from Okinawa, standing in front of a destroyed bunker with a crooked grin and his arm around a Marine carrying an AMX satchel. Harold just kept mixing, because while others fired the guns and flew the planes, someone had to build what made those victories possible quietly, faithfully, from a barn that smelled of sulfur and dust. August 7th, 1945. The sun rose hot and slow over Bell County. Cicadas buzzed in the fence posts, and the earth smelled of mesquite and old oil. Harold Whitlock stood in the barn doorway, one hand resting on the edge of a barrel, the other gripping a letter that hadn't come. For the first time in 19 months, the usual envelope hadn't arrived. No requisition form, no mixing ratios, no truck rumbling up the road. Just silence. He didn't think much of it at first. Mail could be slow. Roads washed out. But then came the radio. An American aircraft has dropped a single bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Harold turned the dial up. Static cracked. The announcer's voice wavered with uncertainty, as if even he didn't quite believe what he was reading. The bomb was unlike anything used before. Initial estimates suggest the destruction of 4 square miles. Lorna stood in the kitchen, dish towel in hand, staring out the window. She didn't speak. Neither did Harold. That night, after supper, he walked out to the barn, opened one of the barrels, and stared at the pale powder inside his old mix, now industrialized, militarized, anonymized. A farmer's remedy turned weapon by men in faraway labs. He wasn't sure what part of it, if any, had made its way into that bomb. Probably none. he thought. But still, he knew enough to understand what came next. The war, he figured, was over. And so were the trucks. Days passed, then weeks. No orders. No men in suits. No notes. The barrels sat full and quiet, as if they too were waiting for instructions that would never come. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. Bells rang in temple. Kids paraded through the streets with flags. Church pews filled overnight. But Harold didn't join the crowds. He sat on the porch in his work shirt and boots, holding a glass of sweet tea and listening to the distant hum of engines overhead. That evening, Lorna came out with the mail, still nothing official. But tucked between a catalog and a church bulletin was a small envelope, no return address. Inside was a photograph. A bridge in the Philippine stone arches collapsed neatly into the water. The backside read, "Taken down without a shot fired. Good dirt, sir. Thank you." No name. No signature. Harold folded the photo and slipped it into his shirt pocket. He didn't ask for recognition. Didn't want a medal. But that one line, "good dirt," stayed with him longer than any government handshake ever could. By late summer, the barrels in the barn were repurposed. Some held rainwater, others feed. A few still had traces of the mix clinging to the insides, like ghosts of a chapter no one wrote down. But Harold remembered, because somewhere, across oceans and jungles and craters, men had lived because a stubborn farmer in Texas refused to believe his fertilizer was useless. November 2nd, 1945. The harvest moon hung low over the Texas fields, casting a soft silver glow across the empty rows. The war was over. The headlines had moved on. Germany in ruins, Japan occupied, troops coming home. And on a quiet plot of farmland just east of Temple, Harold Whitlock was spreading compost. Not chemicals, not mixes, just compost. The barrels were gone now, scrubbed out, hammered flat, or buried beneath scrap tin and rusting farm tools. The barn still held their smell, faint and acrid, like something powerful had once lived there and left quietly in the night. Harold had gone back to growing things, not because the money ran out, it hadn't, but because the war no longer needed him. The check stopped in September. No warning, no farewell. Just gone. The only thing they left behind was a thick brown envelope with a typed certificate inside. For civilian service to the war effort presented in gratitude by the United States Army Ordnance Department. It was unsigned. Harold tacked it to the inside of the barn door next to his father's old seed chart. He never showed it to anyone. But something had changed in the land. People knew. They couldn't say how, but they knew. A stranger from Dallas showed up in a new Buick and asked to buy the property. Offered cash. A big number. Harold turned him down with a handshake and a polite smile. "No, sir," he said. "Not for sale." The ground remembers things. A few months later, a local teacher came out asking if Harold would speak to her students about farming during the war. He declined gently. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "Just tried to keep the dirt honest." But word had gotten around. One morning, while picking up fencing supplies in town, Harold found a note under his windshield, written in a careful hand on the back of a ration card. "My brother made it home from Saipan. I think you had something to do with that. Thank you." He never found out who left it. That fall, he and Lorna sat on the porch most evenings, watching the sky shift into darker hues. They didn't talk about the war much, but now and then, when the wind came in just right and kicked up the dust along the gravel road, Harold would glance toward the barn and nod to himself, as if confirming that yes, it had all really happened. That a man with no college degree, no rank, and no uniform had helped change the course of a global war from the middle of nowhere, using nothing but instinct, sweat, and a belief that even the smallest things can matter. Even Fertilizer. April 10th, 1946. A spring storm rolled over Bell County, washing the dust from the fence posts and beating soft rhythms on the tin roof of the Whitlock barn. Harold stood inside, sleeves rolled, oiling the hinge on the back gate. He wasn't in a rush. He rarely was anymore. Outside, the war had become memory. Veterans returned home in droves. Some limped, some didn't talk much, Others arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and a distant look in their eyes. Every so often, one of them would pass through Temple, see the road signs, and ask a gas station attendant, "Say, is this where that demolition mix came from? The stuff with the funny smell?" Used it to knock out a Jap bunker once. Saved half my platoon. They'd always get the same answer. "Can't say. Never heard of it." But some locals knew better. Not because Harold told them he never did, but because they could feel it in the way he carried himself. Like someone who'd been entrusted with something important, something dangerous, and never once let it slip through his fingers. That spring, a box arrived by registered mail. No return address. Inside was a single item, a brass plaque, simple and unadorned, etched with the words, "In recognition of undeclared contributions to Allied munitions innovation, 1,940, 1,945. It was unsigned. Harold didn't mount it. He didn't show it to Lorna. He just set it on the shelf beside his seed catalogs and his father's old pocket Bible. Some things, he figured, spoke loudest when left alone. Years later, when his grandchildren would ask what he did during the war, he'd smile and say, "Just grew things." Sometimes they'd press, curious about the whispers they'd overheard at the co-op, or the old-timers who called him the powder farmer behind his back. But Harold never offered more, because the truth didn't need retelling. It was packed in crates that crossed oceans. It was carried on the backs of men who stormed cliffs and cleared jungles. It was buried in the ridges of Italy, carved into the black sand of Pacific islands, and sealed in bridges that no longer stood. What Harold Whitlock made never had a name on it, but it left a mark not in headlines or history books, but in the quiet spaces between war stories, the kind shared around fire pits, the kind that started with, "You wouldn't believe what we had to use that day." And somewhere in that silence, in that unspoken stretch of memory and gratitude, his legacy lived. Not as a scientist, not as a soldier, just as a farmer who saw what the earth could give when it was asked for something more.